The rough draft. The story doesn't begin or end like any other story you have heard or have read. And this should worry you. Please understand that I write this from a small room in a very large place. Down the hall, I hear screams and the low hum of outdated elevator music. I could tell you where I am and why I am here, but you should know how. It's always about the how. Along the yellow brick road Dorothy found friends and terrors. A simple trip to the park caused Alice to see and run after a talking rabbit, and to her surprise she fell into a hole that transported her to another place. In order for me to explain the how, I need to do the same. Transport you to another place and time. Will you ever so gently take my hand? Don't mind the drawings, we will soon get to that, and maybe you will have a few of your own. Before I came to live with my grandmother, I was in and under the care of my mother. She did not embrace my writing due to her religious beliefs. I am sure many of us share the same problems as I did when I lived with mother, and like many kids my age, I was left to explore and explain the world on my own and to myself. Due to her behaviors, she didn't allow horror movies and books in the house, even if they lightly touched on the subject. So as many kids have done before me, I hide them from judging eyes. Just as girly magazines can be found under most teenagers' bed at the time, you could find my horror stash under hollow and false floorboards of my old house, that is until I moved in with my grandmother. It was cold. I always remembered the cold days, never the warm sunny days of my youth. I guess the cold finds a way to mark you, even if it was just to worm its way into the people's heads around you and freeze the parts that make them happy. There was a chance I had the flu, or maybe it was a cold. This part of the year I always seemed sick. Maybe it was just a coping mechanism to deal with my childhood at the time. On many days, just like this one, you could find me well covered up under wool blankets, armed with a flashlight and a copy of Fate magazine. Just like the day I am referring to, the day when this all started. Like many other times, I had to fall asleep reading, but this time I woke up a few hours later with one thing on my mind. A place. A place called Lancaster, Virginia. This was a place that would come to haunt me in my adult years, but at this moment the thought turned into a story. I quickly grabbed a notebook and one of the black beauty pencils that I kept on the nightstand. I quickly found myself writing a story that begins much like this one. The story doesn't begin or end like any other story you have heard or have read. And this should worry you. I will be the first to admit, it wasn't much of a story, just about a town that I have never been to, strange events and people. I never finished it, never could put my finger on how to end it. Every attempt would just make the story longer and longer as the details grew and the people took on personalities and faced something that made my skin crawl. As a writer, you know when a story comes to a close, and this one never would. The next morning, in hopes of a smile and maybe some creative encouragements. Over breakfast, I presented the notebook to my mother as she was drinking her coffee and studying the Bible. I watched her with hope and intentness as she carefully read the story I had written. Closing the notebook, she looked at me with eyes that took on the appearance of little hunks of gravel and said, "You must burn this and never speak or write of it again." This wasn't the response I had hoped for. Looking down, I hear her say, "Now be a good boy and go toss this trash in the fireplace." Taking it from mother without saying a word, I pretended to take it over to the fireplace, but I stuck it down the waistband of my pants, coving the top with my shirt. I poked the fire, wondering which part, if not all of the story, had got under her skin, and went back to my room, pulling up one of the floorboards and hiding the notebook. I never spoke of it again, not even to my grandmother when I entered her care. Years later, as I was moving to a new house, I found the notebook and wondered if this place really existed. After a few internet searches, I found the place did indeed exist, and when it came time to take a vacation, this is where I went. At that time, I didn't drive much. The Greyhound was a slow, cheap form of transportation that offered smells, creeps, and the occasional murder. It also offered a rare form of communication, the type where two or more strangers meet and talk about the dark things on the Quicksilver Highway. My trip was short, and other than the rather loud woman and her child that was sitting beside me, I didn't talk to many. I found myself thinking about Mother and, more importantly, the story. The Greyhound bus didn't have a station at that time in Lancaster and made 2 stops in that little town. One beside a large old school and another in front of the Lancaster Tavern. Lancaster County was established in 1651 from Northumberland and York counties. It was home to Robert King Carter in the 18th century, and remaining buildings from that time include Christ Church and St. Mary's, Whitechapel. Other historic attractions open to the public include the Lancaster Courthouse Historic District, including the Mary Ball Washington Museum and Library, Belle Isle State Park, and the Village of Moratico Historic District. There was something off and dark about this town. Even the year that it was established adds up to the number 13. Each of the historical attractions were in my story. How they got there I couldn't tell you, but they were there. I kept asking myself, had I been here as a child before I wrote the story? Or was something guiding my hand that night and controlling my dreams? Strangely, the bus broke down right in front of the old school. Being cramped up for such a long time, I got off the bus and waved on the bus driver, deciding to walk toward town. It didn't seem far. The sun was about to set over a large building with a clock tower. I noticed it as I was stepping off the bus as it started to ring in the distance. The ring sounded old and murky, almost as if you were underwater when the clock tower decided to say hello. As I made my way toward the tower, I saw a light in a building beside the old school. Inside was 4, maybe 5 teenagers dressed in trench coats holding long black baseball bats, standing around what appeared to be a candle or one of the camp stoves as it gave off a bright blue light that shone off the bats. That's when I saw a small groundhog pop out of the gully that ran beside the road. Maybe it was the new place or something else, but I thought I heard the creature say, "He needs to speak with you." Looking back when I heard these words, the bus was gone and the sun had departed. The only light along that dark road came from the greenhouse. The only sound was a boy in a trench coat dragging a black bat along the pavement walking behind me as I picked up my pace toward town.